So I hope that you enjoyed lunch, and I apologize to the people who did not get chicken and vegetables because we ran out of food. Um, I'm really sorry about that. So we upped the count a little bit on the amazing box lunches we have coming at the end of the day with Philly hoagies and veggie wraps. And so if you're one of those folks who didn't get your whole lunch, make sure you're first in line or come find me and I'll get you 2 box lunches because I'm really sorry about that. I know, I feel bad. So we're about to get started with our afternoon panel about collaborative journalism research. That's what's in this room. If you're looking for the cooperatives panel, that is in the New Jersey room. And so we're going to run these 2 concurrent panels, and then after that, everyone's going to be back together in this room. And so with that, Sarah, if you're ready, hand it over.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. And what great 2 days, right? What great work that everyone's doing here. And, oh, thanks. And seriously, what amazing work that we've heard about, and what an amazing group of people. It's so gratifying to see all of you here together and to be talking about this awesome work. So this panel is going to be about research related to collaborative journalism. We have an amazing lineup. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk briefly about some research that I did for the center, comparing models of collaborative journalism, and I want to thank Matthew and Pete for the shout out on that earlier. It's definitely a high point in my career to have a matrix named after me. That's career high point so far for sure. And then I will introduce, and then our panelists will speak in turn, and then we'll have a few minutes at the end for Q&A. So my name is Sarah Stonbely. I'm the research director at the Center for Cooperative Media. In this capacity, I create and execute the research agenda. So some related projects, yeah, I think that's right. Okay, thanks. So some of the other projects that we've done, in addition to the comparing models of collaborative journalism, have been a co-authored paper I did with a professor at Montclair State named Tara George, comparing looking at what makes for success at an online local news outlet. We wanted to see sort of which structural variables were related to success. Another was a survey-based analysis of what local New Jersey news consumers wanted, with some survey data that we got from Free Press. And then forthcoming in June is going to be a paper on the state of ethnic and community media serving New Jersey, which we're really excited about as well. And we're going to have a release event on June 3rd. If anyone is able to attend that, we'd love to see you. So let me just right now introduce our panelists who you're going to hear from, and then they'll come up in turn after I speak about our comparing models paper. Up first will be Lucia Mesquita from Dublin City University's School of Communications and Institute for Future Media and Journalism, where she is looking at the changing political economy of digital journalism. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go back one slide. There we go. And its impact on the civic role of journalism. Before joining DCU, Lucia studied in Lisbon and was a journalist in Sao Paulo, Brazil. After Lucia will be Caroline Porter. Caroline is a journalist, media strategist, and consultant who has reported for Chicago Patch, as well as the Wall Street Journal from both the Chicago and LA bureaus. She'll talk today about some research she wrote for about collaborative journalism, partnership journalism for the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School. And then after her will be Leah Todd, who is New England Regional Manager for Solutions Journalism Network. From 2015 to 2018, Leah led SJN's work in the Intermountain West, including launching and overseeing collaborative journalism projects between dozens of news organizations in Montana and New Mexico. Previously, she covered K-12 education at the Seattle Times and local government at the Casper, Wyoming Star Tribune. So first, let me just talk very briefly about this comparing models of collaborative journalism research that we did, because what we really wanted to do when we undertook this program around collaborative journalism at the center was really understand sort of what types of collaborative journalism were being practiced. We wanted a field-wide survey of what collaborative projects looks like. We released this research in 2017, and I'm thrilled to say that I do think it has held up really well so far. And it still continues to apply to projects that we see coming out in the field, so that's nice. So what I did is I created a typology after sort of diving in, immersing myself in, sort of the different projects that were being practiced, both in the U.S. and internationally, of course, including the Panama Papers and other projects at that time. What I identified were two variables that I think are really really good ways to talk about collaborative journalism models, right? So one variable is the duration. So we've already heard today and yesterday projects of all different durations, right? So you have like a temporary project where people come together for like maybe a one-time thing, or you'll have collaborations where the organizations become really merged at the organizational level even. That's like the highest level that will be open-ended or ongoing. I'm thinking about the other variable, which is level of integration, right? So duration will be temporary to open-ended or ongoing. And then the other variable is level of integration. And there you'll see collaborations where organizations will have very little integration, right? So there is very little editorial oversight, for example, and they'll be working together on a project and then they'll sort of disband and the level of integration is very low. To projects where they'll integrate their back offices, for example, as we see in the Alaska Coast Reporting Project. I'm sorry, I know that's not the right name. So those are the two variables that I identified, and I put together a matrix that I ended up being able to, oh, Joe's not back there right now, is he? Oh, there it is. Okay, so then I put together a matrix, and there end up being 6 different models. So we have one time across the top, we have the duration variable, so it's one time or finite projects, and then to ongoing and open-ended projects. And then on the y-axis, we have partners create content separately and share it. Partners work together to create content, or partners share content, data, resources at the organizational level. And so what we did there is we slotted in the different projects that fit into each of these models depending on where they land on the matrix. So just to go back and talk about the one-time and finite projects where partners create content separately, there were the San Francisco Homeless Project, which you might know about. So this was a project where dozens of news organizations decided they were all going to report on homelessness on the same day. Dozens of San Francisco news organizations of all different media platforms with all different audiences decided they were all going to report on homelessness on the same day. And there was very little editorial oversight. There was, it was basically just report on homelessness, go. But here's the day we're all going to publish it. So the level of integration was very low, and it was a one-time finite project, but it had a huge impact because it was very similar to what we heard earlier in about the BBC project about the North Rail project that Matthew talked about. Huge impact because that's the story that's on all the front pages and in all the broadcast outlets that day in one city. So that's an example of that top left corner. And then moving down to the ongoing and co-creating project. And there we have projects that I'm sure most, if not all of you are familiar with, like the Detroit Journalism Cooperative, Harvest, the Texas Standard, Documenting Hate, right? So there you have a higher level of integration and it's ongoing or open-ended, right? So these are the models that we came to settle on, and I think they do apply well, and I think it's a nice way to sort of think about it if you're trying to slot into one or the other. One thing that has evolved and might not apply as well anymore is the definition of collaborative journalism that we used in the paper, that I used in the paper. And we really focused on collaborations between news organizations. And one thing that's really nice is that collaboration has become more, right? It's become so much more. Now we're seeing collaborations between news organizations and communities. We're seeing collaborations between news organizations and other community organizations like libraries. So that is one thing that's evolved, and certainly still plenty of news-to-news organizations, but that is something that I think is really nice that it has expanded. So happy to take any questions about that research, but that's been out for a while. So I'd like to turn now to our panelists who have brand new research that they're going to share with you. And up first, we're going to hear from Lucia. So just use the back and forth.
Okay. Hello, everyone. First of all, I'd like to apologize for my English, because As you guys know, I'm Brazilian, but today I'm based in Dublin University and Dublin City University, so I speak also a very different English from you guys. So this is a summary of a research that I conducted in Lisbon when I was there doing my master degree. And this is also the base of the proposal of research that I'm carrying out now at Dublin City University. So first of all, what's the most important thing of this research is that it departs from the point of view that organizations of collaboration and collaborative journalism are news organizations. At the first, we thought that collaborative journalism organizations were merely platforms, digital platforms that brought people together to work in a technical, logistic environment. And then during the research, we thought that this wasn't enough to explain the complexity of the collaboration that we are seeing today. And so those organizations are now not just publishing investigations, but they are also teaching and learning from the environment. And they are collecting fundings for them and also for their investigations. And sometimes they also own their own tech, legal, and editorial teams. So this is a very important, important mindset that has changed. So collaboration was always part of journalism. And this research was trying to understand what's the current role of those organizations, the collaborative journalism organizations, in the professional practice and in the media market. And so the general objective was to analyze the impact of the collaborative journalism platforms in the practice of the profession and in the news market. The spaces, like they are new spaces that facilitate, mediate, generate, and disseminate investigations. And so that was the objective of the research. So by impact, we mean all the kinds of change that are sustainable and they lead us to action. So the organizations that we are talking about is these three. I hope all you guys know these three organizations. So ICAJ, most probably all of you guys know, but Connectors is a Latin America organization based in Colombia. And Investigate Europe is European organization, mostly Western organization, okay? And if you would like to know a little bit more about those organizations, I'm here to talk a little bit. So those organizations are known as organizations that practice collaborative journalism, and they demonstrate process and above all, similar commitments towards society. And they are focused in transnationality of investigations. Their research topics are defined by editorial staff and members of the organizations together in a very democratic way. They also have this editorial coordination is also focused on the dilution of cultural differences. That's one of the most important things in transnational investigations. So, and also the cultural differences that everyone that worked in a media outlet know how difficult it is to work with different cultures of investigating and also to circulate information and these kind of things. So the differences between them are the ones that are more interesting. All of them has a very similar way of work, but they have particularities that are important to say. For instance, we have Investigate Europe that works in a way that works in a way that all the journalists that are part of the network, they write an extra in an article of the investigation together, like 18 hands working together in an article piece that after it will be customized by country or by media outlet. And therefore, they are working in a process that is more centralized. Connectors, on the other hand, they have a editorial personnel responsible for each region that nowadays is 6 people, and they are more decentralizing in this sense because they work independently. So, and ICAJ also, as most of you guys know, their approaches of radical sharing, they have a more open process of working. And, sorry, I always forget about changing the slides. So, about the impacts that we saw, and for that I take the Resolve Philadelphia when they talked about intangible impacts. And I would say that those impacts that we are seeing here, it's mostly two different impacts that are very intangible, but are the ones that I think is the most important ones. So to start, the media democracy, what do we understand for the media democracy? This is a policy framework that emphasizes media public services mission instead of treating the media as a business commodity. And to you guys to understand, I would like to read a statement of a journalist in Brazil called Andrea Jeep. She works at Agência Pública, and it follows the same idea of ProPublica from here in the United States. And she said that during a coverage of a feminicide case, she said, "I could not write about this. I could not deepen these reflections, investigate and exercise the journalism that I believe. There was a lack of resources, there was a lack of people, but especially interest and political will on the part of the media outlet that I was working with. And I bribed this depth of journalism to the person that I was covering and the person that I was interviewing. So this is the kind of media democracy that those organizations are able to bring to the media landscape in most of the countries that they work, especially in the global south. And they also bring pluralism to the media market. We are talking about, Andrea Deep is in a country, Brazil, that just 5 families own all media outlets in the country. It's a 200 million people country with just 5 million families covering all the topics. So they are deciding what to do, so what to cover. And these new media outlets that comes with collaboration, they are bringing new topics and new narratives to the media landscape. And also the commercial logic, they invert the logic that privileges profit over public interest and quality journalism. And also news gathering, collect information by citizens, and crowdsourcing, collaborating with the communities. So this is one of the most important things for me in collaboration. The last one is the intermedia agenda setting. That might be weird to hear. The best example of this intermedia agenda setting is the story that was brought by BBC today, Donald Addy, the city council, that they started to cover the news, and other media outlets went out and also spoke about this information. And this is an intermedia agenda setting. So news media have been very close since the very beginning. They operate in a very special kind of environment without much contact with the audience, with the communities. And so by doing these collaborations, they start to prioritize other medias that are new, that are qualified. And so those organizations are the ones that are portraying this kind of quality journalism that they are looking for. So the fact that the other media outlets come to the decision to cover a news event that was considered worth it by these news organizations also validates the media's initial decision. So that's the importance of these news media organizations, these new collaborations organizations that brings stories and brings public interest, because they start to be validated also by other media outlets. So to finish, I would like to mention that one of the findings in my research that one unfortunately didn't go right as I was thinking is the security of the networks that they can provide to journalists and sources. Unfortunately, 2 of the 3 organizations here feel very unsafe in general. So this is one of the topics that I think I'm gonna go in deep this investigation in this side. Okay, so that's all. Thank you so much. I hope I can talk with you guys later. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucia. Up next is Caroline Porter.
Connecting to the internet. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Hi, everyone. Happy afternoon. First, I want to say thank you to the center for having us. It's really exciting to get to participate. And second, I want to say thank you to you all for your attention and attendance. It's really exciting to be here, and I feel like I'm basically experiencing the future. So it's a bright future. Okay. So we are going to talk about, essentially, I'm going to review briefly what work I did at Shorenstein. And in fact, as I've been sitting here, I realized that this is actually a collaboration. What we've been doing, it's called the Single Subject News Cohort. But then we'll actually get into one of the experiments that we did, which had to do with what we called partnerships. So the Single Subject News project was 2 years. It ends in June. And essentially the question was, how can single subject news sites build, engage, and monetize online audiences? And really what we were asking is like, what are new business models for nonprofit news organizations? And how do we go about looking for those? So you may all be familiar with the audience funnel, but this is something that we spent a lot of time thinking about and doing research on. And the groups that we worked with there were these groups. Oh, I'm so sorry, I realized there's the audience funnel. I'm sure you all were waiting with bated breath. And here is our cohort. And so we had a nice range of small to mid to large nonprofit or single subject news organizations. And it was a collaboration in the sense that the cohort got together over the 2 years at several different points and would share data, would share best practices, would talk about issues. It was a really neat, open source place to come together and ask these questions, like how do we think about revenue? How do we reimagine what this could be? So there's an example of one of the kind of experiments we did. We had an SEO expert who worked with each of the organizations to talk about how they could improve their SEO practices. And it was neat because over time they did genuinely improve, which was very cool. So at one of these meetings, these cohort meetings last October, organization leaders this thing kept coming up over and over, and it was partnerships. You know, what are they? How do we do them? Could this be a potentially robust aspect of our business model? And what would be the norm setting that we need to do for that? And essentially, how do we define the emerging terms around it? And so the way we handled that was we surveyed cohort members over November and December. So most of them were mid-sized organizations. One was small, and then 2 of them were larger, like 50 plus. And what we did for this experiment was we defined partnerships as one of 2 camps. Either they were collaboration or they were syndication. And I want to take a minute to just kind of talk about this. Essentially, for the way we defined it was a collaboration was a project between at least 2 organizations that require, at minimum, some commitment to add value. And I think a lot of today's conversation has been about this, which makes sense, it's about collaboration. And then the other thing we talked about a lot were syndication, which were projects where organizations offer their content to other news organizations where you reprint them as is. And I think for the cohort that we were working with, this was really interesting because it's a way to expand their brand, which I will get to more. So again, more about this. What we found was that syndications expand reach. And for, say, an education nonprofit news organization, by being able to share their content with, say, The Atlantic, all of a sudden they had expanded their audience, and then they also had fulfilled their mission of reaching more people, which is terrific. But it was also like, low effort in the sense that you could send an email. Collaborations were more about bolstering their reporting capacity. So if you're dealing with, you have finite resources, the question would be, how do you build off of each other's resources, and how do you work together in a way where the sum is greater than its parts? So with collaborations, we found that you could diversify your platforms, you could reach new audiences, but for both, the main aim of all these, both partnership groups was brand awareness. And I think that this might be specific to the cohort that we were working with, as they were often single subject news. So they wanted to get to a more general audience, and that was something in our broader experiments that we kept coming back to, was like, how do we grapple with this duality where we want to reach the experts in our field, but we also want to reach a general audience? And then this is kind of an interesting thing, that 5 of 8 preferred collaborations. And I think that this might be because you get more bang for your buck. Like if you're gonna write the email anyway, you might as well make something that's even bigger than what you have to start with. So moving right along. So we kind of like we were really interested in like, okay, so what's actually just happening? And with workflow, we found that the collaborations were a much heavier lift, which makes sense. But there was a lot of different ways of going about this, and I think Project Facet is like an example of something that will probably change if we were to do this survey later. I think it's an example of a way to bring all these things together, because we definitely found that like everybody was doing an ad hoc use of platform. And then syndications, this was interesting because it was so simple, right? It was just they had a couple different organizations would have just like a giant listserv, and they could send their articles to this whole listserv, and there was like an MOU or just like an understanding in general that you could take it as long as you applied certain rules, which we'll get into. Okay, personnel, I thought this was kind of interesting, was that it was often the top leaders of the organization that were brokering these partnerships. So the executive editor or the founder in one case. And something else that I thought was interesting is that the word partnership was cropping up more in job titles, which I also just think is an example of how this aspect of what we do is increasingly codified and important and going to be an established part of the industry. And so requirements. This was probably the thing that people had the most to say about, because they, especially for syndications, less so for collaborations, I think that it was sometimes a burden to get the other organizations to do what they asked, and they would describe how they would have to email and kind of ask again, like, could you please do this? Could you please do this? Things that they asked for almost universally were credit bylines, which seems like a given, homepage links, and then metric sharing, primarily page views. And then half of the cohort required prior review and specific credit placement, meaning like they didn't want their name at the bottom of the web page, they wanted it at the top. So here's some graphics to ease your eyes off of the words. Essentially, this is an example of what the requirements were. And again, you can see what were the primary ones. And then these were examples of who participated in the collaborations or in the syndications. And it's definitely, what this shows me is that organizations are taking this very seriously and that it's willing, they're willing to invest their time, capital into making these things happen. So that leads to numbers. This is interesting to see. So we have, on the left side, we have a small member of our cohort, a mid-size, and then a large. And you can see, if you look at them, in all of these cases, they're pretty much going up. Like, the trend is upward for both collaborations and syndications. And I think that, what we have found is that the attention here is definitely to expanding reach. And as part of that, as it becomes more and more common to do these types of partnerships, it's becoming easier and easier to make them happen, which increases your numbers. So all of the organizations except for one rated partnerships as being critical to their long-term strategy. And I think that's obviously important when we think about what's to come. The last kind of like sticky point I want to mention is something that did come up was the issue of payment, which is most do not require payment for work, but some did. So specifically, we're looking at syndications for this, where you would be reprinting it. And the example we had was CPI had a syndication payment with The Atlantic for a per story payment every couple weeks, which could be like a promising model for some of these nonprofit news organizations that are looking to expand their reach, but also need to deal with the bottom line. So that is all. Thank you so much for your attention. I see the question.
Whose name goes first in a credit language? How is that decided?
I think that that's part of the MOU, and they all have like different ways of deciding it. But I think that so if it's for a syndication, it would definitely just be the organization that produced the work. And for a collaboration, I think that's probably part of a much larger conversation. Thanks, everybody.
Great, thanks, Caroline. And finally, Leah Todd.
Hi, everyone. I am so humbled to be in this room and so excited to learn from everything that everyone else here is doing, and also excited to represent some of the work of the Solutions Journalism Network, which has, for the last couple of years, been heavily involved in several collaborative projects across the United States, some of which you have heard a lot about, others of which you have not. And so my goal today is to talk a little bit about how we've used research and thought about impact tracking to both improve collaborative efforts around the country and to talk about a new effort that we're just getting started on to understand the relationship between the collaborative approach and solutions journalism, which I'll talk a little bit more in a second. Great, so a quick definition for those inquiring minds. Solutions journalism is rigorous reporting about the responses to social problems, in addition to the problems themselves, in case anyone was unclear about what that was. All we're talking about here is extending the skills and the questions that we ask as reporters every day to interrogate what's being done about these issues, in addition to asking hard questions about the problems themselves. So when we approach a collaborative project at the Solutions Journalism Network, by no means does every story that's produced as part of this effort have to match that definition. So this is a general understanding that the main thrust of a collaborative project would include the solutions approach, but not every story needs to meet that criteria. So some helpful language to help us all understand. We have worked now with more than 50 news organizations across the country on 6 different collaborative journalism projects that span 6 states. My work with SJN has been heavily involved in collaborations. In fact, my first job for SJN was in 2015 when I got in my car and drove across the states of New Mexico and Montana, 2 very big states, and I sat down one-on-one with editors and newsrooms there, and I pitched the idea of collaboration, and I explained the concept of solutions journalism and why it resonated with me as a journalist, and I asked, what would this look like in your community and in your newsroom? What about this is interesting to you? What are the sticking points, and what seems most valuable? This was part of a larger research effort that SJN was undertaking at the time, back in 2015 and 2016, with a grant from the Lore Foundation, based in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And we wanted to understand the ecosystem, buzzword of the day alert, of the local news organizations in the inner Mountain West, which is a relatively understudied and in some ways not that well of an understood community as compared to our urban friends in more major city centers. So we wanted to know from news consumers, how do you get your news? And what are your local news organizations doing really well? And what can they be doing better? So we asked a lot of questions. Keep in mind, I'm a journalist, not a PhD researcher, like all of the people who came before me on this stage. So these questions that we were asking were really just gritty and tactical. You know, what are the news organizations that you rely on a daily basis? How often is your news relevant and consistent to you? And this is the big finding that came back. Throughout all of our survey instruments, we had about a 1,500-person Google survey that we did online, and we had 164 paper and pencil surveys that we did throughout 10 focus group conversations in 10 different Mountain West communities that said just 1 in 5 people felt that their local news was serving them regularly and consistently. We also found a big gap in terms of what news organizations covered versus what communities said that they wanted. So across every survey instrument that we used, the economy and the issue of jobs, this was 2015 and early 2016, came up again and again as far and away the most important quality of life concern that these communities were facing. And when we did an actual news analysis looking at news coverage on a given week from a number of news organizations across these 2 states, we found that just 8% of that coverage was primarily focusing on jobs in the economy. So there was this disconnect in terms of what was being covered and what the news needs really were. So we fed this information back to the news organizations who were participating and whose homes were in those communities. And it led to 2 collaborative journalism projects in New Mexico and Montana. So this is 2016 and 2017. So the first one was called Small Towns, Big Change. It focused on rural sustainability issues in the state of New Mexico. The second iteration of that was called State of Change, a slightly expanded, more statewide version. And we also had a project in Montana called the Montana Gap, which looked at the sometimes growing disparity between booming urban areas in that state and the rural counties that are losing population. So I just want to highlight some of the stories that came out of that collaborative because we've heard a lot about cities in the last 2 days, and I really want to give some time and attention to thinking about the stories that are coming out of rural communities and understand what kinds of stories we might be missing in more urban places. So this is a story from KUNM Public Radio, major public radio station in New Mexico, looking at a business incubator in the Navajo Nation and the efforts that they were doing there to sustain the local economy. This is a story from the Taos News in Taos, New Mexico, looking at an effort at the state level to create a tax break, a tax exemption for multi-generational northern New Mexican farmers whose family had owned farming land for generations and whose kids could not take over or didn't want to take over the land, and to keep these families from selling out. A story from New Mexico PBS. My colleague Sarah Gustavus is in this room. She helped work on this story that looked at how an effort in northern New Mexico at a county level, in one of the counties with the highest fatal overdose rates in the entire nation, was starting to, with federal funds, try and track people better so that after leaving the jail system, folks weren't overdosing and dying within the first 2 weeks of getting out of jail. So it targeted that specific window, and we looked at efforts underway there. Lastly, the first project in Montana looked at that economic disparity question, and the second group decided to take a look at mental health issues in Montana with their second package of stories. And one reporter looked at an initiative underway in New Hampshire where a group of local gun store owners were pioneering a network that would train gun store owners to spot and be able to respond to clients who were expressing suicidal thoughts. So I want to pause at this point and just ask for a show of hands. How many of you live in what you would consider a city or an urban area? Raise them high and proud. Okay, so look around. Okay, you can put them down. How many of you live in what you would consider to be a rural area? Not the suburbs, a rural area. High and proud. Me too. Lebanon, New Hampshire. How many of you are journalists who cover a rural community at your job, even if you live in a city? Okay, there's some of those too. Great. So I point that out because what we were trying to do with these early projects and what we are now working on doing in New Hampshire, you heard from Melanie Plenda this morning, is to create a model of collaborative journalism that works to support local newsrooms in their communities, so that responds to the needs of the newsrooms in rural communities and responds to the needs of those communities themselves without the concentration of media that happens in a place like Philadelphia, which provides an interesting set of challenges. So like with other collaboratives, we at the Solutions Journalism Network measured impact on two levels. First, we looked for impact on news professionals themselves and for impact in the real world. This is feedback collected from the Montana Gap collaborative editors after the project had completed. These editors lived 200 miles away from one another, and they were convened as part of a group of 12 news organizations that decided to cover issues of shared importance in their state. So this feedback speaks to the kind of impact that we regularly see. So it's creating value for news organizations by creating the kinds of relationships that foster other collaborations in ways that we can see and anticipate, and in ways that we can't anticipate, but that meets a need for that news organization. And on the community level with these news organizations, we saw something really interesting, which is when one newsroom in one rural community republishes a story from a sister community or another community from far away, not only does that story travel and greater audience comes to the original news organization, but that idea travels too, which creates conversations in those communities that need those sorts of ideas about how to approach a problem locally that wouldn't have existed otherwise. So in addition to asking, the usual suspects in terms of metrics for us, how many editors say they'll continue producing solution stories after this collaboration? What proportion of stories were co-reported and cross-published? Those are questions that we regularly ask. We also want to know what proportion of news organizations want to continue working together. And this is a quote from our reentry project playbook, so the collaborative toolkit that Liza Gross wrote that's available for free online. That speaks to something that I think is a really important metric. No matter what you say, no matter what impact you see or how much work it took to get this collaborative together, if the news organizations decide that it met some need for their mission and their organization, it's been successful on one level. So here's what's next. We're now in our 6th collaborative. Philadelphia, New Mexico, Montana, Connecticut, and New Hampshire, as well as the Charlotte Journalism Collaborative. Many of these folks are in the house today. We know some things about why collaborations are impactful, but we really want to know a lot more and to get very granular and specific about why these work. And when they do work, what are the factors at play? So one key question that we're tracking down now is this. Lots of news organizations partner in many ways to produce a lot of great journalism. I'm a huge fan of the Since Parkland project that we heard about this morning, ProPublica's work. Not every collaboration decides to take this sort of solutions approach, right? And it's still phenomenal work. So the idea that we are wrestling with now is to try and quantify what is it about a solutions journalism approach that changes the way that newsrooms work together. Is there anything there? And if there is, what is it? So is it something about having a neutral convener coming in to set the stage? Is it more about introducing a new skill, solutions reporting, that we all learn together that somehow disrupts the competitive mindsets that newsrooms have traditionally had? Or is there really something about focusing explicitly on where the evidence suggests that something is actually working rather than just focusing on the problems that creates a different environment? That's what we want to know. So we built a survey. This is built in collaboration with Lindsay Green Barber of Impact Architects. And in it, we ask about participants' attitudes toward solutions journalism, attitudes toward collaboration, specific factors that make them want to collaborate, and all their anticipated sticking points. So I'll move quickly through this because it's so early stages, and I want to add lots of caveats here that this is a small sample size. We're just at the beginning. We do intend to replicate this with all future collaboratives. But just to give you a picture here, we've so far surveyed 16 newsrooms in the 3 states where we're currently working: Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Charlotte. It's about a 70% response rate, at least in terms of one or more newsroom representative being represented in this survey, plus a number of other actors who responded as well. And this is what the SurveyMonkey analysis came back as the largest, most represented themes that came up in the what are the factors that contributed to you wanting to participate in this project. Open-ended, people could say what they wanted. And I think this really captures what we're trying to create for newsrooms: local, opportunity, and journalism. We are creating opportunities in local journalism. A quick snapshot of the kinds of feedback that we're getting from editors as we hear from them in this process. This is exactly the kind of thing that we see a lot. You know, in a place with fewer and fewer resources dedicated to journalism, where newspapers are losing staff, this is an important opportunity for my newsroom to do something that we couldn't otherwise do. 8 responders said specifically that solutions journalism was important to them. Not everyone did, but 8 specifically called out the solutions reporting approach in response to that open-ended question. Others pointed to this as a learning experience, which we talked about yesterday as a really important factor when you're looking at starting a collaborative, a sort of learning posture among the news organizations. The ability to experiment, the interest to experiment and learn from one another is a crucial key to success. And then on a statewide collaborative, like what we're doing in New Hampshire and what we've done in Montana, different newsrooms have different kinds of needs. So for a rural newsroom, it could be really important to connect to the larger newsrooms with more statewide focus in the urban centers. And vice versa. For urban-based newsrooms, it's to gain access to stories they wouldn't have had otherwise from parts of the state they can no longer cover. For academic partners in particular, student involvement can be a big perk, creating opportunities for students. That's also a big selling point for editors who are looking for interns, logistical help, research help, and that kind of thing. So one of our agree, disagree questions on this survey tried to get at journalists' attitudes toward collaboration. And I was shocked by the numbers that came back, that there is already, for the journalists that we're surveying here, a built-in understanding that journalists outside my news organization can make a meaningful contribution. Now, obviously, folks have self-selected for already participating in a collaborative project, so we might be just measuring, you know, the choir here, but that's one opportunity for further questioning. And the second question that I'll highlight is this one, which is meant to understand whether there's an association between solutions journalism and pulling together other groups of journalists. And after a long discussion with Lindsay Green Barber on whether to frame this question as a positive, solutions journalism makes it easier to collaborate, or as a negative, you know, should we test it as solutions journalism makes it harder and see if people disagree? We decided to do it this way, and the association is there. So only one respondent said it made it harder. Most people actually say a solutions approach makes it easier to collaborate with your peers. And we have a lot more questions, a lot more work to do to understand what exactly is behind that. And obviously this is just the beginning, but there's a lot more to unpack there. So what's next? We will have in-depth conversations with the respondents so far, with the folks we're working with. We'll share the results back with the newsrooms and have conversations about whether it resonates with them. And then we hope to learn from that process, share the results again, and repeat with a post-survey at the end of at least these 3 collaborative projects when they finish kind of a key component of their work. So in closing, I just want to leave you with the question that motivates this research, which is, Would the reentry project have been as successful if it was only focusing on doing what news organizations had always done, which was rooting out corruption and surfacing new problems? Important work, no doubt, but would there have been the same level of response or community success if it had focused on doing what journalism had always done? Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Caroline. So I'd like to call the entire panel back up to the stage. And while they're coming up, I just wanted to sort of recap with a thought or two. Thank you. You know, collaborative journalism takes place across a lot of spheres, right? Across different spaces. So in the newsrooms, in the content, in the audiences, in the impact, and there's a lot to look at there from the research perspective. And it seems like, you know, as we're in our third journalism summit, you know, it seems like we know a lot about collaborative journalism now. Like, I feel pretty good that we have a pretty good handle on things. But a panel like this just reminds me there are still so many questions, and there's still so much to be learned. So, you know, there's things to learn about impact, and I know there's a lot of ongoing excellent research. We heard about some today around, you know, what is the difference between looking at impact and measuring impact with collaboratives versus just for single newsrooms. What, you know, questions about the journalistic culture, you know, that our researchers could answer. And then, you know, the questions that Leah posed at the end about, you know, what is the difference, what is there a difference, and what is that difference when you add solutions journalism to that mix? So it's very exciting as a researcher, right, to see how much there still is to know. And I'd like to throw that out as the first question to the audience. What questions would you all like to know? You know, you have the researchers here in front of you. Is there anything that you still want to know about in terms of, you know, after hearing about research, or just questions that you've had as a practicing collaborative journalist? So think about that. I'm going to get these mics activated. We good? Yeah, we're good? Okay. Does anyone have any questions that they've been thinking about? Any research questions or questions as you've been undertaking your own collaborative projects? Yes. I think I'm the runner of the mics as well.
Hi, I'm Rick Timms from Charlotte, and I just want to say, first of all, this is great to see, you know, a lot of research being done on how these groups are coming together. Question I've got, which is one that I have dealt with over the years, is the issue, and the Associated Press deals with this in the way they share content. You know, there are indemnification agreements with their partners. Are you finding that there's any of that going on among these collaboratives, or has this been an issue with any of the collaboratives as far as indemnifying each other on issues of liability and that sort of thing?
Hi, thank you so much for your question. I think that is a really critical component, not to be overlooked. The short answer is we did not find clarity. There was not a clear trend. If there was a trend, it was that they sometimes asked. We have like a pie chart. If you go, you can see a write-up of the learnings. I meant to mention this on Shorenstein's Medium page, and there's one pie chart, and it says, like, do you require some type of MOU? And what I recall is that the largest percentage, if I'm correct, was sometimes. So I think it kind of depended on the circumstance. I will also share that I think a place to look would be ProPublica. They have dedicated a page to just saying, like, how to take our content. And I think that they're very thorough in how they've thought about it, and that might be a place to look for best examples.
I was struck by, in Caroline's presentation, did you say half of the newsrooms in that cohort required some sort of prior review to the stories before sharing them or republishing them elsewhere?
That's correct. Yeah.
So that would be a way to maybe safeguard or share editorial standards across the group, which I think is an important cultural norm to agree on. I'll just mention that the group in New Hampshire actually came up with a set of standards and guidelines for freelancers, which has also, I think, proven to be very useful to newsrooms themselves and with student journalists. You know, in order to produce content for the Granite State News Collaborative, here are the kinds of journalistic standards that we adhere to. It's, I think, pretty simple stuff, but really important. And so that might be a model to take a look at, too.
I would like to share the experience of Connectas in Latin America. They are thrilled to share all their content and the way that they did the investigations. But unfortunately, the media outlets around the region are not that interested in the topics that they cover. So for them, the most important thing is to share. So yeah, sometimes they rely on partnerships with other organizations like them to spread the news. I don't know if it helps.
Yeah, I also want to shout out an article that Stephanie Murray, the director of the center, wrote, which she collected, maybe from some people in this room, like I think 5 to 7 MOUs of actual collaborations that had taken place, and put them together as links within this article about MOUs. Right, Stephanie? Oh, you're here. Good. Yeah, so that I think a lot of people have found that really helpful, just the actual MOUs that people have used as well. Other questions? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Allison. I think this probably goes to Leah. When you have the slide up that says referencing the number of people surveyed in the community that wanted more news coverage of the economy and jobs, without collaborating, local outlets can use their metrics to look at that same data and also survey their existing audiences. And what I've found when we've done that at my current and past employers is that we don't always see that bear out. People tell us they would like to see more of X, Y, or Z topic, and then when we cover it, it doesn't actually get the attention we're expecting from them. So do we need to wait longer and collect more data on it? Like, what is the approach to bear out those numbers when people are still putting the metrics behind murder and mayhem stories?
I think that's a great question. And there's so many answers to that. I think the one answer is that there are many ways of listening to your audiences, and that's just one way. And if so you found that this particular assessment didn't resonate with what your audience is telling you with their behavior they want to pay attention to, then it might be time to reassess, the research that's been done. And maybe you have better ways at your news organization of finding that information, right? You may not need to survey the community. It might be as simple as setting up, a name card in a coffee shop and listening to your community for a little while. And I think it's a broader question for any news organization that's trying to weigh, time on page metrics, eyeball metrics versus what you might think of as a greater journalistic mission to serve your community. It's a good question, and one that I don't think there's great consensus on in terms of what metrics really should direct our coverage, but definitely would love to hear your thoughts on that.
If there are no further thoughts, unfortunately we're out of time, but I wanted to put the Twitter handles back up. You can tweet at any of us with further questions or thoughts or comments. Thank you so much for your attention, and thanks everyone for participating.
Thanks, everybody.
And so we are going to have a 15-minute break, and then everyone is going to reconvene back in here for the end of the day for our plenary talks and the final keynote. So if you like your chair, save it. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.